In 1906, Mr. Kiss brought Margaret Toth to his home. Margaret was smitten. Kiss was intelligent and handsome. On the couch, Kiss leaned down to kiss his new love. While kissing her, he wrapped twine around her neck, bit into her throat, and drank her blood. Hello, and welcome to Rope. If the story of Bela Kiss doesn't give you goosebumps, well, then nothing will. What Amy dug up while researching this blew my mind, and it just may redefine what you think you know about vampires. But first, as many of you know, this is our very last report for Season 2. We'll be returning Halloween night with a brand new set for Season 3. And since this is our last report of the season, we thought that we would share something personal with you. The reason that we made this report is almost as bizarre as the report itself. So please, bear with me as I share with you what happened. It is creepy. It was January of 2023 when Amy and I decided that we would try our hand at creating a paranormal YouTube channel. She had been a school teacher for many years, and I was a financial planner. We both talked it over, and we decided that we would quit our careers and put everything we had into YouTube. And our first channel did not do so well. But from the very, very beginning, Amy and I shared our channel with everyone, asking them to check it out and subscribe. Well, one night in February of 2023, Amy and I were in Home Depot, and I struck up a conversation with this young man. He was perhaps in his mid-30s, and he had a very distinguished look about him that I'm sure I will never forget. He had jet black hair, and it was slicked straight back, and he had very dark eyes. His skin was oddly pale, and as far as I could tell, it was blemish-free. He had no wrinkles, freckles, or scars of any type that I could see. This is odd, right? Because every one of us has some kind of blemish, but he didn't, and it made him look almost artificial, like a wax dummy or something, except for the fact, of course, that he was animated and talking to us. His attire was odd as well. I'm sure that his clothing was tailor-fit, so that definitely made him look out of place in a hardware store. I don't remember exactly how the conversation started. I do remember, however, that as we were talking, he seemed to be very interested in what I had to say, and I can't exactly remember what that was. But he was amicable. He was leaning in, warm, listening, and letting me do most of the talking. I do remember that at some point in the conversation, I began to feel a little uneasy, and that's because of the contrast between us. See, I'm in my 50s, and I definitely feel my age, and I'm positive I was old enough to be this man's father. But he acted like, and it definitely felt like, he was the older person, a seasoned, relaxed gentleman who already had life all figured out. And to me, that was freaky. The entire time that we were talking, he kept just this hint of a smile on his face, and he acted with a strange, relaxed confidence, as if he knew something that the entire rest of the world didn't. At some point, I mentioned my channel, and I pulled out my phone. I wanted to show him a short video. On the other channel, I had this 4-minute video, and trying to promote my channel, I would show it to everyone who would watch it. Whenever I did, most people would watch it to about 10 or 15 seconds, and then they would say, okay, I'll subscribe. However, we got to the 15-second mark, and he just kept watching. and he watched it all the way through, standing there in Home Depot, which of course made me think that he really liked the channel. So when it ended, I offered him a card and I asked him to subscribe to the channel. And to my surprise, he politely said, "No, thank you." And he turned me down, which was weirdly defeating. But what do you do, right? So I smiled, thanked him for his time, and walked away. And I thought, well, that was that. But it wasn't. 20 minutes later, out in the dark and nearly empty parking lot, just as we were getting ready to leave, he would give Amy and I both the scare of our lives. Amy and I purchased the items that we needed and left the store, and we were just about to get into the truck when a voice from behind startled me. So I quickly spun around and I saw the young man that I had been talking to in the store earlier. He was standing there beneath the parking lot light, and he was looking even stranger than he had inside the store. I caught my breath, and then he asked me a question. He said, "Was Bela Kiss ever seen out during the daytime?" At first, I was completely confused. I mean, he took me off guard, and I had no idea who Bela Kiss was, and I had no idea what in the world he was talking about. So I asked him if he would repeat the question, and he said that he liked the idea that my channel kept an open mind about the strange and mysterious, but at the same time, being sure to research all of the facts. And then he asked if my research team, which I'm sure that he did not know at the time, was just Amy, could find any documentation or proof that Bela Kiss had ever been seen out during the daytime. I told him that I had no idea who Bela Kiss was, and he replied with, "This is really strange. You will." What does that even mean? And he thought that it would be perfect for our channel. The first thing that I thought was that, well, maybe he changed his mind and he was going to subscribe. So even though this was extremely eerie and creepy, I kept myself very polite. To make sure that I wouldn't forget the name, Bela Kiss, he asked me if I would write it down. Now, what happened next took maybe 15 seconds, and it truly gave Amy and myself chills. I turned, leaned into the truck, reached across the seat, opened the glove box, grabbed a pen and paper, handed it to Amy. She wrote down the name, Bela Kiss, and then I turned back around. And in that short amount of time, no lie, this guy was gone. Remembering it now raises the hairs on the back of my neck. I stood up on the running boards right away, and I poked my head up above the truck, and I looked all around the parking lot, but there was no sign of him. I remember thinking at the time that, wow, he must have ran fast, because there's no way that he could have walked away that quickly. The moment was surreal, and Amy and I took just a second, looked at each other, and had a quick laugh of relief. We readjusted ourselves, and then we put the paper with the name on it into the glove box, and we drove off. At that time, we were right smack dab in the making of another video, and we completely forgot about the paper. And then about 2 weeks later, as I was cleaning out the truck, I came across that paper. Still having no idea of who Bela Kiss was, I gave the paper to Amy, who, as most of you know, enjoys a good history puzzle. She took it to the computer and figured that, well, a quick Google search would answer the question about whether or not Bela Kiss had ever been seen out during the daytime. But it proved to be just a little bit more difficult than she had first thought. 6 hours later, after doing continuous research, she came to me and she said that she thought that we should do a video on Bela Kiss. She said that she couldn't exactly find absolute proof that this guy had ever been seen out during the day, but more interesting than that was the story of this guy's life. She shared some of the highlights, and I was sold. His story really is crazy. It's dark, and it's strange. We did a report on it on the other channel, and I think it got all of maybe 500 views. But because it was so interesting, we decided that we would bring it to you. After all, it is October, the month of Halloween. So, in this video, we're going to examine the possibility that vampires just might be real. And we'll do this by first taking a look at Bram Stoker's Dracula. And the fact that, did you know this? He originally claimed that his book wasn't fiction. He said that it was a retelling of true accounts, but his publisher would not publish it unless it was published as fiction. And we'll tell you why during that section. And then we'll take a look at the life of this man, Bela Kiss. It is bizarre. And if he wasn't a vampire, well, then he has got to be the very closest thing that this world has ever seen. And I only speak that half in jest. And then stay with us for our fact or fiction section. There, I'm going to take just a minute and ponder a couple of deeper questions. Questions that really should make someone think. And then what we're going to do for our sit down, Amy's going to come on, and instead of going over some scientific facts like she usually does, I thought it might be interesting if she and I reminisced over that night. So we sat down for the first time in over a year, and we shared our feelings with each other about what happened that night in Home Depot. And you might find our conversation interesting. So, this report begins thousands of years ago. Tales of vampires date back thousands of years. Stories of creatures that drink blood, hunt at night, and are immortal are nothing new. However, ancient Mesopotamians, Hebrews, Greeks, and Romans placed these blood-drinking creatures into the same category as demons. Depictions of creatures drinking the blood of humans have even been found on pottery shards from the ancient Persian Empire. Despite the occurrence of these vampire-like creatures all throughout history, the word vampire, interestingly first spelled with a Y, didn't appear in English until journalists in Europe reported on the horrific vampire epidemics in the 1700s. Tales of vampires terrorized neighborhoods to the point of mass hysteria, and those believed to have been actual vampires were tortured and killed in some of the most horrific ways. During this time, belief in the undead was so strong that in some cases, as to not take any chances, some people actually dug up those suspected to have been vampires and drove stakes through the hearts of their lifeless corpses. The vampires in books and movies today originated from Southeast Europe in Transylvania, and the novel that kicked it all off? Well, Bram Stoker's Dracula, of course. And the story behind the creation of this book is extremely interesting. Bram Stoker's epic novel, originally titled The Undead, was published in 1897, and as I mentioned earlier, it was originally intended to be published as non-fiction. Bram Stoker said that he never set out to write a fictional horror story, but rather it was his intention to deliver the findings of true deep research. In the general preface of his now iconic novel, he wrote this:
I am quite convinced that there is no doubt whatever that the events here described really took place, however unbelievable and incomprehensible they may appear at first sight. And I am further convinced that they must always remain, to some extent, incomprehensible.
And this wasn't some gimmick either. Bram Stoker adamantly defended Dracula as a work of nonfiction, even writing this about the book.
All the people who have willingly or unwillingly played a part in this remarkable story are known generally and well respected. Both Jonathan Harker and his wife, who was a woman of character, and Dr. Seward are my friends and have been so for many years, and I have never doubted that they were telling the truth.
So, if Bram Stoker's intention was to publish this book as nonfiction, then what happened? Well, after 7 years of researching and writing, he sent the manuscript to his publisher. Now, it's important to note that during this time period, there was a rash of brutal, almost non-human crimes happening in Whitechapel. History remembers this time period as the time of Jack the Ripper. Fear across the region was at an all-time high as details of horrific crimes made their way through Whitechapel and the surrounding areas. To make matters worse, the killer was still out there. Not long after receiving the Dracula manuscript, Stoker's publisher, Otto Kilman of Archibald Constable and Company, returned the work with a single word scribbled across the front: no. The publishing company was not going to be responsible for igniting mass panic by publishing Dracula as nonfiction. The publishers at Archibald Constable and Company made it very clear that the novel would be released as fiction or it would not be released. Finally, the Dracula novel that we all know and love today is but a shadow of the original work. Evidence shows that the first 101 pages were completely removed. The epilogue was shortened and tens of thousands of words were stricken from the work. It makes one wonder, what facts did Stoker include in the original manuscript that were considered too dangerous to publish even as fiction? This in itself may not be enough to make you ponder the possibility that vampires may exist. But the main subject of our report, Bela Kiss, just might. Records show that a man named Bela Kiss was born to Janos and Varga Kiss just outside of Budapest on July 28, 1877. But there are questions as to whether or not those records actually belong to the man who later identified himself as Bela Kiss. We have quite a bit of information on a man named Bela Kiss from about 1900 to 1914, or maybe a little later. Information before and after this is vague or non-existent. Here's what Amy found out. History depicts Kiss as dashingly handsome and exceptionally well-versed in culture, literature, and history. Some people say that he could talk so deeply about certain historical events that it was as if he had actually lived them himself. He was known to be into astrology and into the darker areas of the occult. Although he claimed to be only skilled as a tinsmith, he was scarcely ever seen working, and strangely, he always seemed to have money. Money he would almost always use to throw extravagant and stylish parties. Kiss dressed impeccably, with tailor-fitted suits, and was very much the ladies' man, with blonde hair and strikingly crystal-clear blue eyes. And he was highly sought after by nearly every girl in town. Records show that at times, Kiss sported a new lady on his arm almost every other week. Oddly, as the stranger at Home Depot suggested, Amy never did find any record of him definitively being seen out during the day. But I want to make it exceedingly clear that just because Amy didn't find any proof of him going out during the day doesn't mean that he didn't. I'm sure he conducted business and did things during the day, and I'm sure that there's some indisputable proof out there somewhere. I think it would be impossible for a person to run one's life solely at night. Now, that being said, even though it was difficult to prove Bela Kiss had ever been recorded out during the daytime, several sources recorded him being out at night.
Kish owned a car and could be heard driving through town late at night and into the early morning. No one knew the reasons behind his oddly timed excursions, yet it seemed as if he would spend several days in Budapest and then return to Syncota just as the sun was coming up.
At some point, Kish settled into an apartment in Vienna with a young lady named Julianne Paschak. And oddly, during this time, several women began coming up missing in and around the area. Later, when the couple split up and Kish moved back to Budapest, these disappearances stopped. In 1912, Kish settled down with a woman named Marie, and he moved into a home in a small town called Syncota, just outside of Budapest. And at some point, he found out that Marie was having an affair with a man named Paul Bicari, and being no one's fool, Kish ended the relationship immediately. And not long after that, Marie and her lover abruptly disappeared. Kish claimed that they ran off to America. Now living alone, Kish hired a housekeeper named Miss Jakubek. Some sources give her first name as Janosne, and not looking a day older than he did a decade earlier in Vienna, he dove back into the dating scene, and once again, he was known as the ladies' man. To separate his home life from his playboy life, he kept his home in Syncota and he rented an apartment in Budapest. Budapest was much larger than the small town of Syncota, and there was a much larger pool of women for him to choose from. As if a new woman every other week wasn't enough, Kish also ran ads in the romance column of the newspaper, claiming to be seeking marriage, when, in fact, what he really wanted was something much, much more short-term. A little fine-tuning and he had the perfect dating routine, and it went something like this. He would meet girls, either in person or through the paper, take the ones that he liked back to his apartment, date them for a while, and when the relationship seemed to be getting more serious, he'd bring them home to Syncota, and thereby make them feel very important. However, his housekeeper and many of the neighbors noticed that sadly for Kish, none of the relationships ever worked out, and strangely, it always went the same way. The women that he liked enough to bring home would stay for a week or two, but then suddenly and abruptly, they would just leave him, seemingly vanishing into thin air. Kish would tell everyone that they went back to Budapest and they did not leave a forwarding address. Whenever Kish wasn't looking for a bride, he would spend his time collecting large metal drums and tinkering with them in his workshop. He would fill them with something and then he would solder them shut. He collected so many of these drums that people began to suspect that he was making and storing moonshine, or worse, hiding something that he most certainly should not be hiding. Eventually, he was visited by a police officer, and he was asked to open one of the drums. Well, he showed the police officer that they were all soldered shut, and he told the police officer that they were only filled with gasoline. He said that he was stockpiling fuel in case political tension turned into a war, which it did just a few years later, World War I. For some reason that baffles me, the officer accepted this explanation and just left without looking into a single drum. Meanwhile, in Budapest, for some strange reason, several girls started coming up missing. Strangely, right around the start of World War I in Budapest, women were coming up missing. Occasionally, witnesses told investigators that just before these ladies disappeared, they would mention that they were going to meet a young, handsome stranger. The Budapest Police Department was certain that at least two of these cases were related. Miss Varga and Miss Shamatic, both widows, went missing right after they were going out to meet a man by the name of Hoffman. Shortly after this, the war called for every available man, and Bela Kiss was drafted. So he organized his drums, set his affairs in order, and he left his house in the care of Miss Jakubek. After he left, surprise, surprise, those disappearances stopped, and those cases turned cold. Now, the next part of this story has two versions. Some sources say that about a year and a half later, in late spring or early summer, Bela Kiss was behind in his rent, and his landlord went to his property and discovered something horrific. Other sources say that around the same time, war efforts called for all the material that people could spare, and soldiers near Sincota needed gasoline. In this version, the soldiers were informed of the fuel Bela Kiss had been storing in those drums, and they went to his house to retrieve it. When they broke through the soldering and opened the first drum, I'm sure that you can guess they were mortified by what they found. Inside wasn't gasoline, but rather a strange brown liquid and the well-preserved body of a young lady. The property, of course, was immediately quarantined, and police descended on the home. Heading up the investigation was Chief Detective Charles Nagy. Detective Nagy looked over the girl's body, and on first examination, he found evidence that she had been strangled. But on closer inspection, it was discovered that she had 2 puncture marks on her neck, opening up her jugular, and oddly, her blood had been drained. This woman had been strangled, drained of blood, and then sealed up in this metal drum. Detective Nagy looked at the other 6 drums, and his stomach sank. When he opened them, sadly, just as he suspected, each one contained the body of a person who had met the same fate as the first. Strangled, puncture marks, drained of blood. Among the bodies were some of the missing girls from Budapest. There was also the body of Julianne Paschek. That's a young woman who Kiss had shared an apartment with a decade earlier in Vienna. There was Margaret Toth, the woman that I mentioned in the open of this video. And there was also the bodies of that adulterous couple, his ex-wife Marie and her lover Paul. Paul's was the only male body that police ever found associated with the Kiss killings. Evidently, the couple never did make it to America. While Detective Nagy was opening these barrels, Bela Kiss was supposedly in Serbia fighting in World War I. So immediately, Detective Nagy sent an officer to get word to the military of what was found at Kiss's residence. Then, Nagy ordered a detailed search. Among the evidence found were 17 more metal drums, each containing the body of a young woman who had either been strangled or poisoned, and then apparently drained of blood. Even more disturbing than finding, at this point, a total of 24 murdered victims, was finding evidence in a secret room that there just may very well have been dozens, or possibly even hundreds, more. While searching Bela Kiss's property, at the back of the house, detectives discovered a door leading to a secret room, which was filled with items and books from another era. In the center of the room sat an old antique desk. Also in this room were neatly organized file folders. Each folder, more than 70, contained a complete dossier on a different woman whom Kiss had either met in person or through the newspaper. The files contained a slew of information on each lady, including personal traits, family members, bank account numbers, and even photographs. Each file kept track of every interaction that Kiss had with each woman, from beginning a correspondence with her, to meeting her in person, dating her, and in some of the files, even killing her. Now, check this out. These killings had been going on a very long time. Some of these files dated all the way back to the turn of the century. In the files, the detectives discovered that through the years, Kiss had been using different names, one of which was Hoffman. Some sources say that Detective Nagy later received word that Kiss had died from typhoid. Other sources say that Nagy received a letter from a soldier in Serbia who had been following the case. The letter stated that Kiss was indeed not dead, but rather he was hiding out among the wounded in the Serbian hospital. Either way, history does record that Nagy went to the hospital himself to investigate. Oddly, however, as if Kish had some sixth sense and knew that the detective was coming, Kish killed a soldier who he thought looked a little bit like him, gave the newly created corpse his name tags, placed the body in a bed that was designated for Kish, and then, some sources say, he escaped into the night just minutes before Nagy arrived. And the ruse just might have worked had Nagy not so deeply been involved in the case. He had been closely studying the photos of Kish for months, and he knew that this corpse was not Kish. So the case remained open, and the search for Kish continued. Over the years, and then over the decades, reports have come in from people who have claimed to have spotted Bela Kiss. Some of these reports have been from extremely reliable people, such as seasoned detectives who know what to look for, or soldiers who are trained to spot a target. But to this day, neither Kish nor his corpse have ever been found. So, what do we make of all of this? Do vampires exist? No. Surely they don't. The modern world would say that that's absolutely impossible. But if they did, and if they truly were the undead, being around for hundreds or even thousands of years, wouldn't they have become very good at hiding by now, even fooling scientists and anyone looking for them? And wouldn't they stay in the shadows, keeping their dark secret hidden from the rest of the world? I want to make one thing exceedingly clear. I do not believe that the gentleman that Amy and I met at Home Depot that night was a vampire. It was a strange experience, for sure. But there are a lot of different and interesting people in the world. Looking back, I think that the most likely explanation is that he was just very intrigued meeting a YouTuber and he thought that Bela Kiss would be a good video for our channel. However, I do have to say that his disappearance at the truck was strange, and to this day, I do have a difficult time understanding exactly what happened. Speaking of Bela Kiss, if vampires do exist, could he have been one of them? History classifies Bela Kiss simply as a demented serial killer with a strange fetish for blood. The puncture wounds on the necks of the victims, they believe, were made by a machine of some sort, and not vampire teeth. When I heard that, my first thought was, and this is because it is well known what type of marks vampire teeth make, right? If Kiss was, or I guess I should say is, a vampire, and he did drain the blood of his victims by biting their necks and sucking it out, well, how would we know what type of marks that would leave? There haven't been a lot of studies done on this type of process that I'm aware of. Maybe whatever marks he would leave would look a lot like the marks that we found on those bodies. Just saying. For this video, Amy and I sat down and we spent just a few minutes reminiscing over that strange night at Home Depot. So this is not going to be our normal interview with Amy. All I did is set up the cameras, and we haven't discussed this, not really, for like over a year. So I don't know how this is going to go. So it's probably going to be very boring, but we're just going to reminisce about that night. It's a very freaky night. We haven't talked about it. What do you remember about that night?
Well, the first thing I remember is, we're shopping and I'm just, la, la, la. And I hear you all of a sudden, saying things like, oh, you should check out our channel. And I see you're showing your phone to someone, which it's no surprise. You've never met a stranger. But then something changed. I felt kind of weird. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes. This person didn't look like he was from this time.
Yeah.
Very dignified.
Yes.
Stoic almost.
Yes.
Yeah. And he was leaning in and he was listening to you.
Yes.
And it just caught my attention. Like, you've done this 100 times, but something about this one feels so different.
As you say this, I can feel like the goosebumps on my face and the hairs on the back of my neck remembering. So what I remember was, like you said, I don't know a stranger. So I remember approaching him and talking to him. I wanted everybody to subscribe to our channel. And I remember that somewhere in the conversation, I started to feel freaked out because he was young, but he didn't act young.
That's right. That's right.
Is that what you remember?
That's exactly right. It's like an old soul and a very young person.
Yeah, but different than an old soul in the fact that, I've met old souls and like they're wise and everything else. But this guy acted, I can't think of an actor's name that would really make it fit. But he acted just like one of those old, dignified, but very charming individuals. But he was young.
Yeah.
And that's what freaked me out. Also, the fact that he looked perfect.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I mean, different than a supermodel, right? Just perfect.
Right. Absolutely. And I thought about that, the first glance, it's like, oh, is he just, playing a part or whatever?
Got makeup on or something.
Yeah. But then the more I looked at him, the more you two, talked, I was like, he's absolutely genuine.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I got to. So for me, after the conversation ended where he said he did not want to subscribe, that was weird.
Yeah.
I was really, I'm a grateful person, but I remember thinking, I was focusing on the fact that he didn't subscribe and I wanted him to subscribe. And if the second part out in the parking lot hadn't happened, I would not really, I don't think I would have remembered it the same way at all. It would have been a weird experience. So what do you remember about what happened in the parking lot?
So my first memory of out in the parking lot is, we're getting into the car. I'm reaching, to get into the car and I hear a voice and it seems so strange. People say, oh, the voice came out of nowhere, but it really did. I have fairly good hearing and I didn't hear footsteps, nothing, just a voice.
Yeah.
And it wasn't yours. So that was terrifying.
For me, it was really freaky because it was on my side of the truck and it was like right here. And just like you, I didn't hear any footsteps. I didn't hear anything, nothing. And I'd heard this voice and it freaked me out. And I spun around. I was ready, like to die or to kill something. I don't know. I was terrified. I was terrified. I was petrified and terrified.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's a new word.
Yeah,
I love it.
It was freaky. That startled me. After a second, I think I almost got angry. Yeah, because I felt like, whew, that was almost like rude.
Yeah, you don't sneak up on somebody like that. That's a dangerous thing to do.
But I was thinking that, well, maybe he's going to subscribe.
Of course you were. Of course.
And me back then, I was like, everybody, I want everybody to subscribe. And then after that whole experience, which took, I don't know, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, when I turned around and he was gone.
Yeah, that freaked me out, right? Because again, my sight, my vision isn't that great. So I rely more on hearing, and I would expect to hear footsteps, a car door close, engine start.
Yeah.
Nothing. Just gone.
Yeah. I remember being really confused. I remember being really confused and just thinking, my heart was like, how? Where did he go? I remember there was like 10, 15 cars in the parking lot. And I remember looking all around and every car was quiet. Nobody was in the cars. And I don't know what to make of it. He must have ran away, but I didn't hear any footsteps.
Right.
He must have been half ninja.
Or all something else. I don't know.
Yeah.
I remember having that fleeting thought of, do we just meet a serial killer? Like this is going to be in a book somewhere. We got to go. We got to get out. Just that terrified, get me out of here feeling.
Yeah. I remember that you and I kind of took a minute and we looked at each other and it was like,
Yeah. What was that?
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know if you're out there, whoever you are, I hope that you're subscribed to our channel now.
Right. Oh, jeez.
Hey guys, thanks a lot. Listen, season 3 comes up October 31st, and we're gonna have a whole new set. We're gonna have, this is gonna be gone, and the other set's gonna be completely redone.
Excited.
So, all right, thanks.
Thanks.
Bye. So, do you believe in vampires, or are they just a work of fiction? And if they are just a work of fiction, then what do you make of Bram Stoker's adamant claim that his book was not a work of fiction, but it was rather a factual account of events gathered from 7 long years of deep research? You know, this report reminds me of the creatures that were seen drowning people in Zimbabwe. Not because those creatures were vampires, but rather because, just like vampires, those creatures are thought to be just fantasy as well. But between 2012 and 2017, something terrorized divers and killed several people in Zimbabwe, 2 of which were young boys. And here's the kicker. A group of witnesses who saw the boys being drowned swore that what drowned those 2 boys was a mermaid. We did a complete report on this, and if you'd like to see it, it's here.
You always look so fancy. You're all, decked out, and I'm like, whatever shirt's clean.
No.
Yeah. You know what I need to do is hop on over to Fourth Wall, reports of paranormal events, and buy a Check This Out shirt.
Yeah, that'd be great. Oh, we should say that next.
We
All right.
just did.